It is time for the Cyber Executive Podcast, where we'll be talking with top executives about risk, technology, and leadership. I am your host, Marc Ashworth, and today I have the pleasure of having my friend Che Bhatia, who is the managing director at Aon Stroz Freidberg, here today. Che, thank you very much for being here as a guest on the Cyber Executive Podcast.
Marc, thank you so much for having me. So delighted to be on your podcast today.
I'm super excited. This is such a cool topic here around instant response, and I couldn't ask for a more experienced person here to with everything that you've done over the years. So I'm really excited about digging in here and getting a lot of great tips and everything. So in your worldly experiences here that you've had over the years, what are a couple of the most common causes of breaches that you have experienced? Obviously without now giving any details of a particular client or anything, but what's some things that, you could tell us that can help our listeners here, learn what not to do? That's the important thing. What's something common not to do?
Yeah, so Marc, that's a really good question, and we get that question a lot. When you reflect on kind of the, having worked hundreds, if not thousands of incidents. The common causes of breaches that we typically see are really just organizations having, unfortunately, poor cyber hygiene, right? So if you look at, for example, the ways that, attackers will get in, it's obviously somebody clicking on an email and, doing something that obviously they shouldn't be doing. Their software vulnerabilities in perimeter systems or in systems that, unfortunately are just not patched or have good security configuration or just, good architecture in place. And then there's really just poor remote access, right? We see a lot of sort of VPN concentrators out there that are not configured right or architected right. We see, still VDI systems sitting on the internet that are publicly available and that are not, requiring multi-factor authentication and things of that nature. I mean, it's just a lot of pilot error, a lot of human error, a lot of poor cyber hygiene, and when you really think about it, things like multi-factor authentication and things of that nature, I mean, that's been the industry standard for years. Yet we still, see organizations getting popped. And when we do the forensics and really understand how it is that they got in terms of that initial access, it really is just poor hygiene. Unfortunately, that's the common causes of breaches that we're still seeing.
So it's kind of the overall program that you're seeing a lot of issues with, and maybe not just, and I'm sure that's out there too. Individual, oops, mistake type things, you always see on the news configuration, mistakes that's done, and that's going to happen. We're all human. But do you think it's more of the overall lack of a good security program that's causing this, or is it more just basic configuration mistakes that is occurring, or maybe it's a combination?
Yeah, I would say it's a combination thereof. I mean, look, it's people are going to make mistakes, sure, but I also think that going back to my points earlier, it's just poor hygiene. I mean, a lot of organizations are having to do more with less. It's really hard to keep everything patched. There's critical vols that are being released all the time, and folks can't just go in and install patches, right? They have to test those patches, and maybe lower life cycles from prod, right? Whether it be a dev environment or a stress test environment or a, quality assurance environment, a quality control environment before it actually gets out to prod. So there's rules of the road before just installing things out there. And, it just, those systems are vulnerable. And so, when we're sort of called in to conduct the sort of the investigative work stream to understand, what the attacker did, it's rare that we'll see sort of an advanced adversarial TTP, right? That was used to be able to do, what they did. It's just usually poor cyber hygiene. Unfortunately, that is kind of the root cause of typically what we see when we're investigating.
Yeah. Very interesting. When you're on these instant responses and or the working with your clients off there, what are some of the biggest challenges when you come on site to start working with them? What's those challenges that you see or might see whenever you first come into an environment to maybe make it difficult to do your work, or maybe how they're doing things, in that incident to try to help them?
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of organizations out there that are doing really good things. I mean, they're doing their best, right? They have their incident response plans. They're doing their tabletops. They're talking about incident response and readiness and that type of thing. But there seems to be kind of a lack of substance when it comes to sort of the planning around incident response. So, like for example, when we get engaged, and I'll talk about it from a technical perspective first. There's a lot of sort of things that we focus on. We'll want to start to get access to the critical systems in the environment that have sort of the environmental context that we need, right, to be able to understand, what the adversaries did, right, where the breadcrumbs are, hopefully. And so, we'll request access to, a SIM, for example, right, a security incident event management system. And there's some organizations that have outsourced sort of that SIM and SOC operations capability to, a third-party provider. Well, that may take them a day, 2 or 3 days to provision that level of access to us responders, right? And, the first 72 hours is critical, right? So the fact that it could take some time to be able to get sort of provision access to that environment, to start seeing the telemetry that's in there, that's painful. And then there's a lot of folks out there that unfortunately we haven't really had conversations with proactively to be able to understand kind of what's involved in forensic image collection, right? So processors are a little different in cloud-based environments, and so there's a lot of ways we're kind of starting from scratch. As we're starting to have these conversations with clients in a real serious situation. EDR provisioning, getting the incident response team access to the critical systems, and then kind of collaboratively figuring out what is the containment and the eviction plan. If we haven't really had those conversations proactively, or the client hasn't really thought about those things, it's going to take a lot of time to be able to do things that are critical. Time is critical. Things like conducting enterprise-wide password resets are pretty common. Or implementing out-of-band communications, or rebuilding domain controllers, or establishing red, yellow, green system identification and separation. That all takes time, and if we haven't had conversations proactively around what that entails and some of the gotchas and the pitfalls that we typically run into in a 911 situation, it's going to be very painful going through the incident response. Now moving on from sort of the technical side, what we find is some of the challenges is an organization may not have a contract with an incident response firm like mine or whoever they choose to use. And so that can take some time to be able to negotiate. So we always recommend, getting paper in place. You never pick your team on game day ever. And so having sort of, that agreement and making sure that, there's connectivity between the incident response firm and outside counsel. We know how we're going to operate in the first 72 hours is going to be very, very critical. So I would say to sum it up, we see, again, a lot of organizations doing good things from a preparatory perspective, but it's lacking substance and it's lacking depth. And when it comes to, the real world and something has really happened, we just find that folks, unfortunately, are just not prepared to the level they could be if they're having these types of conversations with their go-to incident response firms proactively.
So Shay, do you recommend, once you select a partner for this, and you get the contract stuff in place, so that way you can go whenever you need them. Do you also recommend to have maybe those accounts provisioned ahead of time and have that access ahead of time, or does that just add more risk and then you should wait to do that, but maybe have it in the playbook to have it ready and know what to do or who to set up, in those cases of the emergency?
Yeah, Mark, that's just a phenomenal question. So, we get that question a lot, right? Should we start to define accounts? Should we start giving you guys, privileges to particular things so you can run your tools or whatever the case is? Our positioning there is that we don't think that's necessary for the reasons you kind of mentioned, right? The additional risk. What we do encourage our clients to think about, and you kind of alluded to it in your commentary there, is that there needs to be a playbook and there needs to be an understanding of what it is the incident response firm is going to need, right? What when they engage with you, in a serious situation, what's their methodology, and what are how do they use what you have in your environment today, and what are the tools that they're going to bring to bear in the incident response and investigative processes, right? So I think it's important to understand that and have sort of a playbook or just a process in place. So when we are in a 911 situation, the incident response firm is engaged, that we can activate sort of what's in that playbook and get the incident response firm the access that's needed, so we can get that done in a timely fashion, so we can start to execute on the tasks at hand.
Yeah, great. So, you have a robust incident response process. You go through your tabletop exercises. So how do you measure the effectiveness of your incident response process? You can do your tabletops and everything, but really, how can you measure how good you're doing off of that? Any recommendations there?
Yeah. That's another really good question. I think, when you ask how do we measure the effectiveness of your incident response processes, my take on that is, well, the smaller the business impact that occurs as a result of the incident, the more effective your incident response processes are going to be, right? So, just to kind of take a step back, we see a direct correlation to those organizations that are intentional about, really thinking about incident response, but also, thinking about building an effective business continuity and disaster recovery program, right? And we see that when there is maturity in that regard, there is a reduction of business impact when there's an incident. So, when we kind of focus on the BCP sort of thematic area, if an organization, for example, is doing a business impact analysis, right, with their teams, and they're having conversations around impact and risk tolerance with their business teams, or they've done a business continuity program evaluation to just kind of assess where are they at, or they have processes in place for crisis management and crisis communications. Well, a cyber incident is 100% a crisis, right? And could be one of the, if not the most serious thing that can happen to an organization, right? So being able to understand, sort of how we're going to communicate, or just doing supply chain analysis and understanding sort of vendor resiliency, and okay, if we're down, but we still need to provide this to our client, what's our sort of game plan around that? How can our sort of partner ecosystem or what have you still continue to do what they do, and we can reduce impact to operations, or even just plan exercising, right? Can be very helpful. And then we see, again, a direct correlation to those that really, if something happens, they recover, and they recover admirably, not only focusing on sort of the BCP side of the house, but when it comes to like disaster recovery, just assessing the current infrastructure and hardware to support recovery efforts from a cybersecurity related disaster could be incredibly impactful, right? And this requires discussions with core stakeholders, whether it's systems folks or server folks or hardware folks or network folks or help desk or endpoint database application folks, to really understand the depth and breadth and nuances of the current environment and really understand, okay, well, if we have an infected environment, but and there's forensics that's starting to happen, we're collecting, critical information, but the business is like, hey, we need to recover these applications and we need to get up and running and that type of thing, we may be limited to hardware. We may not have enough hardware to keep the current red environment intact while we're trying to build a new green environment to recover, our backup or to install our backups from or that type of thing. So understanding even from a hardware perspective, are we capable of being able to do the forensics, investigation, but also restore operations? I mean, that is absolutely, important to talk about. And then, just understanding sort of the application footprint, right? Doing some type of, we call it internally application disaster recovery, and understanding the capabilities there. There's a deep dive that we think is required into critical applications to analyze, the current recovery capabilities and to identify risks, to ensure that the organization is meeting their, recovery objectives, right? So highly technical analysis, looking at the backups, looking at the recovery, looking at the existing documentation, testing to industry best practices is going to be critical. And then, when folks like us get engaged, right, the incident responders, we ask the client, okay, what's critical to get back up and running? The client is now positioned to be able to say, okay, we need to get these applications up and running. Here are the sort of the web servers, the application servers, the database servers, the backend dependencies that are needed to be able to get the application up and running. Here are the infrastructure dependencies. Here's what they need to talk out to on the public internet, et cetera, is incredible value for us to help the organization get up and running, as opposed to kind of figuring this out on the fly. What could take several weeks to recover now takes weeks to months, because we're kind of doing this all on the fly, figuring out how the environment works.
Definitely practice makes perfect, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the whole point of the tabletop exercises and getting those people aligned in those exercises and doing different scenarios whenever you do that. With everything that you kind of mentioned there, you talked on a lot of critical components of a robust incident response plan, as well as, even from a practicing component of it, to take those things that you talked about in there. So how do you prioritize and triage security incidents, based on, severity and potential impact? Because you might have a couple of different things that, when you're in there, in an incident that's happening, and, as you're going through looking at the data, I've seen it where you think it's happening, this is happening here, but in reality it's happening this way. Because the log data are, maybe not correlating properly. And so you kind of go down some rabbit holes before you kind of focus in on to where the actual root is of the problem. So how do you prioritize and triage those incidents and which will lead to the recovery component of it later?
Ideally, it's really the organization that is prioritizing and triaging the security incidents based on severity and potential impact, and they're letting us know, they're giving us guidance typically on what the severity is. Now, if you were to ask me how would we advise our clients on sort of determining what's severe and what's not, in my mind, I would say, look, anything with high severity is a threat actor that's maybe really active in the environment. there's a threat actor active sort of on keyboard, using tools like Mimikatz, or Cobalt Strike. They're establishing persistence using, again, tools like, Cobalt Strike or AnyDesk or similar tools. They're laterally moving into the environment using things like RDP or SMB, or we see activity like, data access or exfil activity using things like rclone or S3, or even exfilling entire VMs. We've seen that, or exposing cloud-based systems, externally to encrypting or deleting backups or encrypting files on a system. That is active, hands-on keyboard. Well, I consider that to be pretty severe. Whereas there might be some automated related incidents like a coupon plugin for Chrome or something of that nature that, although that's not something we want to see in our environment, I mean, from a severity perspective, that, it needs to be actioned, but it's not as severe as, some of the other things where a threat actor is actively engaged in the environment. So, how do we recommend our clients prioritize and sort of triage these types of things? It really is based on impact, and it's based on actually what is happening in the environment and the consequences of that. That would, be our advice to our clients to say, look, that's incredibly severe. You need to make sure that we have a plan in place to be able to counter that particular activity.
Great. So, as we all know, some industries are more regulated than others, as well as those that are publicly traded, has a lot of compliance requirements on there. So when an incident is involving sensitive data or regulatory compliance requirements, do you what do you recommend to do differently with that than maybe someone, and maybe the answer is there is no differences, you should handle it the same way outside of the reporting components of it?
Yeah, I think from our standpoint, when we're doing the forensics, we are very cognizant about asking questions around, what are your regulatory obligations? Are you GDPR compliant? Do you operate in countries like Canada or Australia or other parts of the world? Because obviously there's very specific data jurisdiction laws that you have to abide by. Even with us, like we can't take possession of evidence, from, let's say, an environment in Canada and move it here to the U.S., right? There's certain ways of kind of handling those types of situations. So when it comes to, sensitive data or regulatory compliance, from our standpoint, we tend to ask those questions so we know how to be able to manage that in the forensic and investigative process. Now, obviously outside counsel is going to be very engaged. There's going to be privacy folks from the client that are very engaged, or legal that's going to be very engaged. And so, a lot of times they're trying to ascertain, look, was data exfiltrated? Was data accessed? Was it touched? And these are all things that we will seek to find out in the world of forensics. And there's some cases where, while we're conducting the forensic investigation, and may be advised that the organization reach out to the threat actor via, a ransomware payment and negotiation firm who are experts in that particular activity to understand what the attacker did or what they took, right? And so, when you ask me how to handle, how incidents involving sensitive data or regulatory compliance, how do we handle that? It's really awareness of what we're dealing with, so we ensure that we're not violating what we've agreed to contractually with the client, but then through the forensic investigation, actually trying to help the client understand what the attacker did in terms of the data, so they can proceed with their notification and disclosure obligations, whatever that may be, whether that's international data laws or local state laws or that type of thing. Our goal is to help them understand that information so they can proceed with their reporting requirements.
Yeah, and a key out of that, as you mentioned several times, is around the communications of that.
Mhm.
Whether it's with the client or with management. So, during an incident or in preparation for instance, that communications with different stakeholders in the business, whether it's marketing or obviously the CEO, maybe the board, and other executives that the security team will be working with, and as well potentially as you, to provide those updates. How do you effectively communicate and collaborate with those different stakeholders during an incident?
Well, I think it's really important. First of all, if the organization is dealing with a seasoned incident response firm, usually they're going to have folks like me leading the breach and the incident response, right? So, we tend to, my peers at other incident response firms or even in our firm, we tend to really understand, what are the typical things that a general counsel is thinking about in a cyber incident, or, the risk manager who's in charge of the insurance coverage, right? What they're thinking about. Last thing we want to do is, be sort of encouraging the client to do all these different things. And then the next thing when it comes to submitting that claim and getting the insurance carrier to, pay for that claim, they've identified that there were things that should not have been done during the course of that incident response. So understanding sort of, what the risk manager or whoever owns the insurance, the risk transfer strategy, right? The insurance sort of program at the organization, whether that's a risk manager or treasury or, legal or whoever. Understanding what the communications people need to be thinking about, whether it's internally or externally, or even investor relations, right? There's certain sort of, expectations that the SEC has for publicly traded organizations. So, for us to be able to understand sort of best practices around that, when to communicate, what to communicate, and these types of things, that's, that counsel is not necessarily coming from us. That counsel is really coming from outside counsel. But having an incident response firm that has sort of that legal understanding and that technical understanding, that investigative understanding, and understanding what all the roles are thinking about or have to think about in an incident response situation is incredible value to the client, right? Because it's not just about the technical sort of forensic objectives, right? Understanding what's patient zero, did the attacker take data, did they not? Is the attacker still in the environment? These are all things that we focus on the forensic side, but also understanding what all the other critical stakeholders are going to be thinking about, and then advising them with counsel on best practices so they understand, what we've seen and what our recommendations are so they can make well-informed decisions given their situation at hand. So the bottom line is, we encourage all of our clients at least, engage a firm that has that competency around these different areas, so we can be a good advisor in that breach or incident scenario.
Great. Well, let's take a little pivot here, a little bit here. When we've talked or you kind of hit on some of these things, but much like last week was the Super Bowl, and so I guarantee you the Chiefs and the Eagles didn't just show up to the game without any practicing. So organizations have to practice incidents,
Yeah.
and there's got to be training and awareness programs for that, because the more times you do it, the better you are, and you don't want to have to create stuff or do things on the fly. So what is your approach or recommendations for organizations for training and awareness programs when it comes to incident response?
Yeah. Mark, that's a really good question. I think, there's the industry recommendation is, have the incident response plan, have playbooks, There's also organizations now that are developing what's called placemats. So think about it like when you studied for your last security certification, you went and bought, let's say the CISSP, right? The big CIS book. And, over time you studied that and then you kind of narrowed it down to, Cliff Notes, right? To kind of keep that sort of content in your memory. So when you're ready to take the test, that's front and center. It's you've exercised that muscle memory, and hopefully you do well on the test. So a lot of organizations now are building that sort of placemats, 1 or 2 pages for each of the sort of senior leaders, right, on the things that they would have to think about in an incident, right? Those are all highly effective tools. What I find is in the context of training and awareness, that's kind of where we stop, right? The playbook, the plan, the placemats or what have you. What I have observed in almost the 8 years of doing this work, leading small, medium, and some of the biggest breaches to date that have been very public, is that when we engage with organizations at times, what we find is the people that are really involved in the incident response have never been through an incident response situation. So to expand upon your analogy or your commentary around the Super Bowl, we expect people to score touchdowns in an incident response situation, but they have never touched a football, right? Let me repeat that. We expect folks to score touchdowns, but they've never touched a football. So, in that case, how do we expect them to take on tactical things and move the needle forward on critical tasks, if they've never done that? So, when you ask me, what are some best practices around training and awareness, one of the things that, we will recommend to our clients is, typically there's the incident commander, and then there's the incident responders, right? So when you look at like the incident commander role, that is a role where they're the focal point, they're at the top of the stack of responders. They have primary ownership for designing and executing the response, right? These folks are responsible for incident management. They're responsible for tracking. They're responsible for work stream identification. They're responsible for task assignment, tracking, containment, and eviction planning and execution. A lot of times they're developing and executing upon a risk register with known and presumed and unknown risks resulting from the incident. That all takes training, right? It takes awareness of like the tooling that they'll have to use and how to manage that to effectively serve as the incident response commander, right? And then you have the incident responders, where when there's a large incident, the response will be executed within multiple work streams. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier, enterprise-wide password resets, segregating systems based on risk. What we find is that clients may have tribal knowledge of potentially being able to execute a particular task, but the skill set that they have to execute the task is typically non-existent. So training and awareness, well, there should be run books or levels of execution where they know what they need to do for those particular work streams. So this is again kind of from the train as we fight approach, with the goal of developing a muscle memory amongst the incident responders. And then obviously, we've got others that are responsible for certain things in the incident response side too. I think having those folks meet with their go-to incident response firm and saying, hey, what are you guys seeing? What do you recommend? What are some of the pitfalls that you run into? And keeping that cadence with, folks like us can be incredible value from a training and an awareness perspective. So again, to sum it up, commanders, incident responders, and those that are on the front lines, let's get them touching the football. Let's get them maneuvering the football. Let's get them comfortable with the football. So, when game day hits, we're practiced, we're prepared, we're ready to go.
Yeah, and I think it's important for those people that's touching the football to understand, how to get to those results, and whether it's, in their area of expertise and how to get to the data to look at, to do that forensic work that needs to be done and be able to provide that off of there. And whether that's, from a football, understanding what the, all the different lacing and all that stuff does for you or whatever it might be, but, you still have to understand that. So, very good. So let's kind of change it up again here. And something I've been asking all my guests here lately, just to kind of have some fun with this here, is, what is something in the security industry that we could be doing better?
I think we could do a much better job sharing information, and I know that there's a lot of effort out there to share security information within the private and the public sectors and what have you. But by the time information gets out, right, from the public sector, right, to folks like us, sometimes it's outdated and it's got to go through many levels of approvals to get clear to be able to release to us. At that time, it's old or not really super relevant. We got to do a better job sort of collaborating with each other and sharing of information. So one of the things that we've really been intentional about at our firm, and I've been intentional about with my clients and those that I'm privileged to serve every day, is, we'll do quarterly threat debriefings and just say, hey, based on the incident response work that we're doing, this is what we're seeing. This is how we're seeing the adversaries evolve their TTPs. This is how they're weaponizing things like PowerShell or whatever the case that it is that they're doing to be able to do the bad that they do. We share that tactically with our clients. So our clients are not protecting in a vacuum. They know, coming from us, one of the largest global top 5 digital forensics and incident response firms, they know what we're seeing, and we're having great dialogue about that. And those that clients of ours that are really intentional or will capitalize on that, it's a beautiful display of my team, who's on the front lines every day working on incidents globally, sharing information, very helpful information to our clients, and then our clients are like, that's really interesting, we didn't know that. Or how would you recommend that we do this or protect, or how do you recommend we detect that kind of activity, right? Or, so it's a beautiful display of just, collaboration between us as the incident response firm and those that are relying on information from us or finding that information helpful to be able to then take back and look at their environment and say, boy, let's fine tune this, or let's turn this on, or we have this, the absence of this control that's really problematic. We probably should maybe look into, procuring that tool or whatever the case is. And so that's what I would say the industry could do better, is maybe tapping into, those that are on the front lines every single day, working on breaches and incidents and getting the sort of the lay of the land, so they can take that feedback and do a much more of an effective job protecting their environments.
Right. So, what you kind of mentioned about your quarterly report and stuff that you have, what's some latest trends you've been seeing in the incident response landscape that maybe you're actively monitoring or seeing happening over maybe the last 30, 60, 90 days that might be going, forward?
Yeah, I would say that, if I walk you back a few years ago, back in 2019, I think that we all remember quarter 3, quarter 4, all of our lives changed because of the pandemic. And, when I reflect on kind of my experience just working with our clients and just our clients as an organization, we had our clients that were lifting and shifting workloads to the cloud, or scaling systems, or embracing new things in such a rapid rate or rapid clip, because they had to, keep technology operations going given all the changes that were happening. Security necessarily wasn't at the forefront of all of that, right? It was functionality, technology functionality. And because of all these changes that were happening and all, and security really not being considered, that's why we saw the activity that we saw in 2020 and 2021 and 2022 in terms of the ransomware activity. It just kind of peaked north because to the attackers, it was a wash, rinse, repeat approach, right? They had all these environments that were ridden with vulnerabilities because, again, security was not at the forefront of a lot of these things. It was functionality. And if you recall, the insurance markets were like, hold up, wait a minute, this is not okay. Like the exposure that we're sustaining is incredible given what's going on. And so what do? They started requiring organizations to have blocking and tackling controls, right? MFA, EDR, segmenting the networks, having an incident response plan, a business continuity plan, having a managed logging and monitoring provider. They're like, look, these are like the top controls that you guys really need to be focusing on for a cybersecurity maturity. And so what we saw was in the last few years, a lot of organizations started to invest in those controls because they didn't want their premiums to go up, or they didn't want to have a declination on the insurance side, or they didn't want to lose coverage, or whatever the case is. So bottom line here is, now to answer the question very precisely, now we're at a point where, when I think about the incident response landscape and kind of what we're actively monitoring, we are very concerned that there's a lot of organizations that have invested in controls the last few years and think that they're in a good spot. And essentially they're defending, they're protecting, they're detecting sort of the adversarial TTPs of yesterday, as opposed to knowing what the adversaries are doing today, right? So there's a delta. And so for those organizations that are not on the cutting edge to really understand what the adversaries are doing and how they're circumventing MFA, how they're circumventing EDR, a lot of times we're doing, EDR control effectiveness and efficacy testing. The organization can have the best EDR control in the world, like, the SentinelOnes or the CrowdStrikes or whoever, the Cyber Reasons, and, the list goes on and on and on. But if they're not tuned right, they're not configured right, they're not, deployed right, attackers are going to find ways to get in, and they do. So what are the latest trends in the incident response landscape that we're actively monitoring? It is, making sure that first our clients are aware of what the adversaries are doing and how they're attacking, and then making sure there's detections in place in their environment to be able to detect the latest adversarial TTPs that we are seeing, how they're attacking, so they can hopefully detect that soon and then stop the attack, before they sort of succeed throughout their kill chain. So that's what we're actively monitoring right now.
Great. So, out of everything that we talked about and everything else, what is something that you're tired of hearing about in the industry?
Oh, wow. You're going to get me in trouble with this one, but I got
but it's going to be close to the same answers as everyone else has been saying. So
I gotta be truthful on this one. What I'm really tired of hearing is someone saying, or a client saying when they were hacked, that was a really sophisticated threat actor, or that was a very sophisticated attack. If you really put things to the surface, how the attacker did what they did and how they attacked, the TTPs that we saw are things that we saw 5 years ago, right? And so to me, just again, being super transparent and candid, like it almost gives the appearance like we're kind of hiding behind sort of the thought or the excuse that, hey, that was a really sophisticated threat actor, that was an A+ hacker, and there was no way that we could have like detected that behavior or circumvented that behavior, prevented that behavior, or whatever the case is. And so, I really think that security practitioners and technology practitioners really need to step up to the plate and say, hey, that we had some poor hygiene here. We could have had an opportunity to do things better, or we should have been paying attention to that a little bit more, as opposed to hiding behind the sort of the excuse of we were attacked by a very sophisticated threat actor, because it does happen. I mean, there are very sophisticated threat actors out there. There are people that are really doing incredible things. I mean, from a sort of a skilled trade perspective, sometimes I'm like, wow, that's really impressive what the adversary did, right? It's almost a, I know this sounds bad, but it's almost like a, wow, that was very creative, right? So there are those types of hacker groups or adversarial groups out there, but I don't think most organizations are dealing with those types of adversarial groups. So that's what I'm tired of hearing about. I think people really need to kind of step up and say, look, we should have done a better job protecting our environment and learning from that. Like, I'll give you another example, Mark. Like, when we respond to a lot of these breaches and incidents, one of the things that we're really intentional about doing as a value to our clients is we'll say, hey, can we just spend some time doing kind of a post IR debrief with you and share some things that we really, really think you should be doing to mitigate the risk of this happening again. And it's certainly clients are interested in that. It's free advice. We've been in their environment for weeks, right? So we can provide some really cogent, tactical advice, and then we'll follow up and say, hey, do you guys want to follow up on any of this stuff? Like, we think it's really important. You should really have an EDR. You should really have a logging and monitoring solution. You should really have this or that. And then we never hear from them on the proactive side, right? And then at times they get reinfected, or they may have had a ransomware attack and now they're dealing with a BEC or whatever the case is. So I know I've over communicated on that topic, but that's generally how I feel. People need to step up to the plate and really take responsibility for their work.
Yeah, I agree. And Che, some incredible points here today. Thank you very much for being on here. I mean, if someone didn't have any questions left on what to do or not to do on instant response, I don't know how. I think you covered it all. I mean, it was just amazing. And so thank you very much again for being here. And thank you, everyone, for listening to the Cyber Executive Podcast. Be sure to click subscribe or follow us on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. Thank you, and talk to you next week.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Che.